Hi, everyone. Welcome, and welcome back. So now we're going to turn to a discussion that I'm really thrilled to be your host for, called Calculation Otherwise. Thank you so much to Nora and to Danny for inviting me to be part of this, and indeed to my new friends here, Magda Tyżlik-Carver, Samir Bhowmik, Mary Maggic, and Timothée Parrique. In thinking about what calculation otherwise means, I spent some time flipping through a really classic book at this point called Raw Data is an Oxymoron, edited by Lisa Gittelman and Virginia Jackson. In that collection, there's an essay by Daniel Rosenberg that has this great line: facts are ontological, evidence is epistemological, and data are rhetorical. So facts can be shown to be wrong, whereas data serves a distinctly semantic function. It is rhetorical. False facts can be shown to be false, but as Rosenberg points out, false data, however, is still data. It still makes arguments and creates the terms on which we speak about things, including practices built on top of that, like calculation. What our panel does today is to reformulate their own epistemological and rhetorical practices towards calculating otherwise. Give me a moment. I have to pick up the equipment that I just dropped. There's been a crisis of calculation and data and what it means to calculate for a long time across many societies. Things take on a particularly intense register in the contemporary moment when software is capable of calculation and data practices reshape and remake the worlds in ways that we cannot manage, legislate, or control after the fact. I want to remember a case that I'm pretty sure has been talked about in Transmediale's past and remains extremely pertinent to establishing our discussion today. It's the case of the Volkswagen defeat device, a piece of software that was embedded in Volkswagen's cars for the US market, made between 2009 and 2016. Referred to as a defeat device, the instrument was not physical, but a piece of software that was sensing when the car was undergoing an emissions test in the lab, and on that basis, changed the emissions automatically. It was in reality producing emissions, the car that is, nitrogen dioxide, at 40 times the permitted level. But this high level of emissions also made it a very powerful car. What the device was doing was registering the physical conditions of the test and the context, and then changing the emissions data to suit that context to appear less toxic. This terrible story ends well, to some extent. 6 Volkswagen executives were found to be criminally guilty. But it does make clear that practices of data and calculation are just deeply rotten, manipulatable. And so it is very welcome to be able to engage with these brilliant artists and scholars today to think about and learn about how they are thinking, rethinking, and reframing calculation towards envisioning and making new realities. So today, our shared discussion will relate to how calculation sits otherwise in relation to and refuses existing institutional silos and their organizing logics, their control over resources. And we're going to think about and listen to how they talk about refusing calculation and computation and present alternate kinds of instrumentation towards making new worlds and new subjectivities. So, and eventually, what does that mean for research and artistic ethics and practices? So what we're going to do today is, in our program of 80 minutes, we will have a short input from each speaker, just about 7 minutes, and we'll just go one after the other. And then we'll have an open conversation in a space between all of us, online and offline. And then we'll close with some time for audience questions. And there's a logic to this order that they're going to speak in. I want to start with the non- and inhuman context, such as Magda works in, followed by Samir's theoretical proposal of terror performing, that unfolds land, knowledge, and bodies, and then to Mary's work about bodies and the creation of a queer feminist population study that generates new kinds of measurement practices, followed finally by Timothée's proposal, which is actually a lot like Mary's, actually, to reject the conventional measures of what we understand as society and social progress, or measures of the health of the collective social body, or bodies, if you will. So without much further ado, I would like to turn over to Magda, and then Samir, Mary, and Tim. Thanks, Magda.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction, and I also want to thank Danny and Nora for putting together this interesting panel. I'm very happy to be part of it. Could I have the presentation, please? What if data could be fermented? Data are units of information. They are collected observations recorded as figures and symbols, described, defined, measured, quantified. Data today are big and small, cooked and raw, and when they are raw, they are an oxymoron. Data are taken and given, captured and released, harvested and mined, and they flow. They form bodies of data, ready as input for calculations, for health, for statistics, for marketing, for science, for surveillance, all to be molded, modeled, recognized as patterns of repetition, of proximity, and other correlations. What if data could be fermented? What fermented data would look like? How would it smell and sound? They say that data speak for themselves, but do they? Or do they speak with voices of others, human, non-human, inhumane? Telling bodies of data are amassed, collected, and annotated, giving birth to metadata. HTTP body data are pushed, SQL datasets need a query. Who and what is asking, why, and under what conditions? Things transform, matter becomes another form, formation of molecules, of carbon, management of digits and points. If fermentation, a metabolic processing of matter, is introduced with data, what could they become? To figure a body of data, to give it a shape beyond a number, to mold it into a set or a base or a body is a choice, a decision to model as such or otherwise. Becoming data body and forming body of data is more than a resource and mining raw material, a practice whose inventions in living are precariously captured and stored in the cloud. Whoever thought cloud could keep anything but the rain? What if data could be fermented? What fermented data would look like? How would it smell and sound? Who would share it and with whom? Sphagnum, that peat moss, is a duration. Cecil Mariton says sphagnum is time, experienced through fermentation. Some say that in its most basic, fermentation is controlled decay. Lack of oxygen creates environment to slowly digest what's in it, opening bodies to each other, caressing time, shared. Bodies take time and occupy space. Time is filled with matter. Space expands inwards. Fluid, moving, just passing forever. All organic matter is carbon-based, yet it exists in so many forms. If, as Margulis says, flexibility of carbon is one of the secrets of life on Earth, what can be said about flexibility of data? Fermenting data is a figure of choice through which to practice questions and speculate with forms to provoke discoveries. with data and computation, with humans and bacteria, with plants and jars and memories. Not outside of sciences, computational, informational, and natural, but with them and with other bodies of knowledge, of organisms, of matter and relations. Fermenting data is a refusal and positive resistance to dominant forms of data practices and computation that have defined digitalization, datafication, and other forms of digital transformation through continuous return to colonial and capitalist logic that applies exploitation and extraction as default data practice. As a feminist technoscientific inquiry, fermenting data builds on difference as a method, where two seemingly unrelated phenomena, such as data and fermentation, are brought together to speculate and experiment with practices of living. In fermenting data, data and fermentation are invoked to interact, they diffract each other and they mutate. They cut together apart bodies of knowledge, of data, of science, of microbes, of earthly histories, of cities, of people. Their different becomings captured and living in a jar, in database, in memory, submerged but not hiding, bubbling, burping, releasing carbon dioxide, breathing data. How such worlds can be known, and to whom, when only one way of knowing counts. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Magda. Thank you, Maya, for having me here. Can we play the video, please?
Let's start with the end of the world. We're done with the golden spikes. We're done with the dying calls of white geologies. The so-called Anthropocene is long past. Let's imagine what we are left with is nothing but just this island.
Thank you. So, on the topic of calculation, I want to talk about extractivism, yes, and I want to talk about terraforming, because they both have to do with calculation and subjectivity. And I also want to present a term which has been the focus of my current research and artistic practice, and that's terraperforming, where performance becomes a bridge, a probe, a tool for investigating our relationships with the planet. But as you saw, stepping back, let's start with the end of the world. We're done with the golden spikes. We're done with the dying calls of white geologies. The so-called Anthropocene is long past. And let's imagine what we are left with is nothing but just this island. The cable, the submarine cable, becomes the last connection to what remains of humanity. Rather, it's an object of inhumanity that we have to become familiar with. So these are my starting lines for the Lost Islands project in the last Helsinki Biennale. It was a performative project, a performance expedition that engaged the audience with extractivism, with terraforming, with colonialism, by contemporary dance, improvisation, and installation. Our goal was to probe these topics through the body, through the terrain, through the interaction of the body with the terrain. The tool or the artifact that allowed us entry into that was a submarine cable. And that became our way to enter the human and the inhuman. As John Durham Peter says, we know and use nature only through the artifacts we make, both out of nature and out of our own bodies. And these artifacts can enter into nature's own history. The submarine cable has become today part of so-called nature. As part of terraforming the sea as something that is dependent on extractivism. But extractivism and terraforming entangle geologies, technologies, and populations, not to speak of all things inhuman. To extract, draw it by force with effort, and act a method that is made possible through the body, logistical techniques and media. Extraction inscribes the earth, the body, its environmental, it drives terraforming. And we all know the history of terraforming is centuries old, if not thousands of years old, if not we consider ancient farmers. Ecological interventions were central to colonialism. European settlement in the Americas, slavery, sugarcane plantations around the world. As author Amitav Ghosh says, the explicit aim was to turn territories perceived to be wastelands into terrain, to fit a European conception of productive land. The notion was the land was savage, wild, vacant, because neither tilled nor divided into property. At the same time, other bodies were considered savage, wild, and vacant. So it was by planning, creating plantations that settlers claimed the land. Terraforming started with the land being gridded, numbered, assigned values, calculation, muscular energy, protein and carbohydrates, calculation. Undoubtedly, the project of terraforming enframes the world as resource in which landscapes come to be regarded as factories, nature as subdued. Extraction is undoubtedly part of terraforming that has taken place and still takes place, in which land and bodies get enfolded. To me, these enfoldings are like active processes, like swallowing or ingestion, or in some instance, total appropriation. One can think of how ancient knowledge, counting, calculation, skills, and techniques, bodies got enfolded into machines. How indigenous lands and sea got enfolded into property for making products or producing energy. And as Benjamin Bratton says, how the planet folded itself into a giant camera to observe the black hole. And now what remains is the realm of the inhuman, into which is folded unstable human relations, commodity values, tools, and technologies. Sean Cubitt calls these enclosures that has led to our current condition. Enclosure of the common land, enclosure by technology, and the concentration and concretization in the machines, which constitutes the second enclosure. The third enclosure is the enclosure of knowledge, where labor, physical or cognitive, becomes commodity. Successively deprived of land, skill, and knowledge. In the enclosures of modernity, the human stands on the brink of the fourth enclosure, that of the body. These enfoldings are also part of terraforming of the earth took place. And this is where I think the body has been forgotten. Today, bodies define the machines. The range of movement of muscles, bones, and tendons are manifested in today's extractive machines as automation and robotics. The calculation of the computer entangles with the logics of our brains, neural networks as machine learning. A deep time of the planet is inside our machines, as it was always in our bodies, and now crystallized as part of the contemporary political economy. But surely the body operates on a wide band, not cut up into pieces and pixels. It refuses to become part of the circuit, perhaps even resist calculation. And yet we have, over the last few centuries, the colonial body, the enslaved body, the indigenous body, and all other bodies swallowed up by the machines. By selectively quantifying the body, we have misbalanced the ecology of human-earth relations that now can only be corrected by recalibrating our bodies themselves. as opposed to terraforming that suggests computationally driven geological changes as planetary design initiatives. I suggest the reconnection and rearticulation of the body to the planet by performance. To quote Heather Davis, to reconnect to the embodied practices of looking that deeply acknowledge our implications in the horrors of our times. And as Davis suggests, is there a way to think with contemporary extractivist politics in manners that implicate, embody, intimately encounter the materials of exploitation, instead of the production of images and videos that serve to anesthetize rather than engage viewers? Can we work with the intimacy of extraction and terraforming? Could effective and bodily working through provide a means to think of our entanglements with the violent rituals of industrialized capitalism? Instead of hand-wringing and denunciation, instead of condemnation, could we think of the violence as opportunities for care? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going on to Mary next.
Thank you. Please play the video. In response to the policing of non-normative bodies in the midst of rising environmental toxicity, Genital Panic calls upon anonymous digital archives of our toxic queering bodies. Since the rise of industrial capitalism and endocrine disrupting chemicals, we all live in a profoundly polluted world. To assess how the effects of chemical toxicity has altered or queered ecological normativity, scientists have used the anogenital distance, or the AGD, the distance between the anus and the genitals, as a biometric measurement for reproductive toxicity. The results show that the AGD has been steadily decreasing over time. I see this as an example of molecular queering in action, where many, including environmentalists, have strongly argued is a toxic assault on the male body and the end to our reproductive future. As the impacts of these pollutants range from physiological effects, such as early onset puberty, obesity, and worldwide sperm count drop, to neurological, including autism, depression, lower IQ, it's the sex and reproductive effects that play most heavily to our societal fears and panic. Is it possible that we are all approaching intersex other sex beings? And how have our bodies always been queer, but forced to fit within a binary? In the wake of hormonal disruption, it is clear that our bodies are not as fixed and recalcitrant as we want them to be. We see that our toxic conditions have been and continue to problematize our current notions of a normal and natural body, sex, and gender. So there's a strong urgency now to revise and remake new definitions of eco-heteronormativity. At the same time, we must reflect on how bodies that don't exist within the norm are already discriminated against and pathologized. Some examples include the medicalization of infants born of ambiguous genitalia and the disqualification of intersex athletes from their gendered categories based on endocrinology and sex chromosomes. These guidelines matter. What they entail matter. They determine how we are policed, how we are surveilled, due to our biology, whether or not we fall within the oppressive norm. So, in response, Genital Panic seeks to anonymously crowdsource 3D genital scans and basic demographic data into a digital archive that will be called the Alien Genital Database, or what I would like to call the Archive of Unruly Bodies. This database would serve as the foundation for redefining genital aesthetics and categories for the toxic Anthropocene. The study collects data in a way that chooses the person's gender identity over their gender assignment by doctors. So the project is both imagining and performing a queer feminist population study that deconstructs the ways in which science is performed and therefore how categories are determined. Donna Haraway reminds us that bodies are not born, they are made. So if state and corporate sciences reinforce certain somatic fictions about the body, then so can we. If the AGD is a tool of patriarchal science, then it must be repurposed for social resistance. Participating in this database is equivalent to participating in a counter-hegemonic intervention that dismembers the tool of measuring AGD from its state-owned agenda of policing otherness. The project acknowledges our bodies as unfixed and changeable in this queering landscape. It creates spacious room for our toxic variants and spacious room for all the aliens living among us. As the glitch resists the binary language of computers, so too do the supposed errors of our bodies provide both the material and symbolic for refiguring our toxic future. For the toxic queer, queer is perpetuity, queer is ubiquity. Toxic queer disrupts, perverts, destabilizes hegemonic symbolic order, and ultimately, cis-hetero reproductive futurism. So I'd like to end this talk by saying that this database is for all unruly bodies, for all disobedient bodies, and ultimately, we write our own future. Thank you.
Thanks, and finally to Timothée.
Hi, everyone. We live in a simulated world. I don't mean this in a Matrix style, like we're being raised by robots for fuel. At least if that was the case, we could just fight the robots, easy. The situation we're in is way more subtle. We're stuck in a simulation of our own making. Let's rewind a bit and come back to the birth of what has become the most important number in the world, GDP, Gross Domestic Product, an indicator of economic activity invented in the United States during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Back then, the US government was desperate to get its economy back on tracks, but it had no way of checking whether it was or not. And so they asked Simon Kuznets. Kuznets' genius idea was to aggregate all activity into one single number, a kind of heart rate monitor, but for an economy. If the rate goes up, you know you've managed to reanimate your economy. Back then, it all felt very technical and practical. But a century later, we are starting to realize the disastrous consequences of the invention of GDP. Today, GDP is not only a number, but also a totem. Countries all around the world do their best to maximize the growth of their GDP. This seemingly abstract objective has become a non-negotiable guideline. Governments maximize their GDP, companies maximize their profits, and individuals maximize their income. The maximization of monetary indicators has become the most important code line in the software of modernity, a meta-structure that subjugates all others. It is quite telling that news channels on TV always display numbers about the stock market. This is a reminder of what we think is the beating heart of our society. Even in time of ecosystem collapse and climate breakdown, governments worry about the impact of a potential species-threatening apocalypse on their economies. That reminds me of this cartoon where you can see a dinosaur watching the asteroid getting close to the Earth with a bubble text saying, "Oh shit, the economy." And of course, the economy is important. The economy as the complex assemblage of institutions that coordinate collective work to satisfy needs, that's important. But that's not the economy GDP measures. That's not the economy reflected in stock market indexes. Hence the idea of the simulation. We are living in a simulation where the reality of the economy is shaped by abstract rules defined by abstract indicators legitimated by abstract theories. What we don't often realize is that indicators are political. Any indicator shows certain things and hides others. The choice of what is rendered visible and what is left in the dark is unavoidably political. So behind every indicator, there are always interests. What is counted? Who is counting? And why are they counting? Today, the way we do national accounting ignores nature, downplays inequality, undervalues the work of women and everyone else that doesn't sell stuff on markets. It's not an indicator. It's a distribution scheme. Cut a tree and sell it, get points. Save a tree and let it be, get nothing. This economistic way of thinking legitimates nonsensical behavior like the cutting of millennial forest in the Amazon to grow feedstock so that the rich households of the world can eat beef every day. Or the spurting of tons of carbon into the atmosphere, threatening the stability of the planet's climate just to allow a few percent of the world's richest to fly around for holidays. Some then will tell you that we cannot save nature because we've not managed to put a price on it. The only reason it's being squandered is because it is invisible to our GDP glasses. Maybe we just need more precise indicators. I don't think that's the problem. In fact, I think this waiting game for better models, for better indicators, for better data is deceiving. It only postpones decisions into the future. And this reminds me of a sci-fi short story by Isaac Asimov, where scientists keep asking complex questions to an increasingly sophisticated computer. And every time the computer is being asked a question, it answers, insufficient data for meaningful answer. Today, the biggest dangers for revolutionaries is to play the waiting game, waiting to gather enough data to show that what we're doing today is wrong. Instead, we should turn this precautionary principle around. The present is not working. We feel it. The accumulation of wealth in the global north is sucking the earth dry and handing the bill to the most vulnerable to bear. The burden of proof must shift. Show me the numbers, data, models, and theories to explain how high-income countries appropriating net quantities of money, labor, energy, materials, and soil from the global south is going to put an end to poverty. Show me how we can green growth, even though almost 1,000 academic articles have shown that this has never been achieved anywhere. Show me that wealth trickles down and that enriching the rich makes the poorest better off. Until you do, stop importing the life out of poorer countries, stop wrecking the earth, and stop piling up wealth in the pockets of the elite. The problem of GDP is not the way it is calculated, it is its very own existence. Our desire to aggregate a multiplicity of human and non-human interactions into a single number is just a remnant of that old Cartesian quirk of believing that we can and should control nature. But perhaps certain things should not be measured. Not everything that counts can be counted, and certain things that count stop counting once they're counted. Think of the idea of natural capital, that believe that nature is only one kind of capital among others, just stuff waiting for us to use. Calling it natural capital is already a mistake, and so is trying to measure it. So let's forget about natural capital and oppose the logic of capitalizing nature. Let's call it Mother Earth, like the South American Buen Vivir, and compare degrading natural capital that sounds like oopsie it's fine to harming Mother Earth that sounds like a tragedy. We need to oppose the logic of capital, and the logic of capital can only exist with its measuring apparatus. Without indicators, capitalism is naked. So let's go one step further. We should actively sabotage this mental infrastructure. Let's collectively organize a resistance against the measurement that motivates and legitimates the destruction of the planet. Let's refuse to measure the world with indicators that makes destroying life look like winning a Monopoly game. Decolonizing our imaginaries from this monetary monomania means defending the chaos of the social and ecological against the organizing crave of capitalism that wants to neatly count, name, and package every single thing just so that it can be sold. But imagine, how differently would our societies be if every news channel was at all times displaying the latest numbers about biodiversity loss, global warming, poverty, race, and inequality? So right now, my utopia is the world where we would have forgotten how to measure GDP.
Thank you so much to all of you, from AGD to GDP and from kimchi to the Anthropocene. This is quite a wide range of different kinds of measurement practices, and I'm actually really thrilled by this sort of diversity, because I think that through this, and hopefully in the next few minutes, we'll be able to draw out the threads that sort of connect all of your different approaches to thinking about calculating otherwise. So what we've done is, prior to this discussion here, I'd circulated some questions to all of the participants and panelists that you've just heard from, and we're going to just go through some of those. Actually, before that, I should maybe just say to those who are watching at home that three of us are in the audience here, in the auditorium here at the HKW in Berlin, and we have Mary and Timothée joining in remotely from Zoom, via Zoom. So it's a slightly different kind of process that we've all been, that we're all sort of in right now. I think we've all been used to Zoom for the last 2 years, and this is a slightly different setup. So I really hope that we can still have a discussion in this sort of new hybrid format that we're all getting used to. So one of the first questions I asked all of the participants to think about was, how do you introduce yourself? I know I'm constantly having to talk about myself as being hyphenated in so many different ways, because you find you occupy all of these different disciplines or contexts and geographies. And so I want to ask people, how do you introduce yourself? What disciplines do you identify with? And how do you negotiate being in multiple spaces and locations, and saying that, you know, what it is that you study and what it is that you do? Magda, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I have this temptation to just introduce myself.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I'm Magda Tyżlik-Carver, and you know, when you asked that question, I sort of thought about my surname immediately, because it's hyphenated, and it brings two surnames, you know, which are, one is Polish and one is English. So I kind of sit over there a little bit. But in terms of the practice that I do, I guess I'm a researcher and curator and educator. and art historian as well. And I continuously have to navigate between all these different kind of places and practices. And I sit currently within a digital design and information studies department where, again, it's highly interdisciplinary. So I think what I continuously, and I think most of us have to continuously do, is to kind of figure or decide at different times who we are at that time, so as you asked me that question, I am not going to decide now who I am at this point. I think I'm going to hover in between these different locations or fields or disciplines that I work in. Yeah,
Great.
that's my answer.
You know, and the reason I actually asked that is because I'm curious, I mean, as you respond, Samir, about how your location allows you to speak with authority about the way that you want to imagine and create new worlds.
Yeah, was that a question?
The question was how you find confidence and authority in being located in multiple places through how you introduce yourself, through the different disciplines that you negotiate, and how this sort of affects your practice of counting and calculation.
Yeah, it is a struggle, but it's also fun. Yeah, I consider myself like transdisciplinary, as a lot of us do. And also, it's been quite a process and a journey going through learning different professions. Literally, I started as an architect, and now I'm doing performance. That's crazy, but it's how the journey of discovery happened with the research, with the artistic practice. It just leads you on, and you look at methods, and you discover new methods. And then the methodology of the practice leads you to question different disciplines. And so I think that's pretty much has been my process of where I am. And it's hard to negotiate all these different disciplines and methods and processes. Sometimes I feel like I'm pretty much a logistics person, like, you know, there's a whole supply chain of methods and artists and digital devices. And there's an infrastructure of stuff. And you're like kind of juggling between all these worlds. So.
Great, thank you. I wonder if Mary and Timothée, who are remote, have anything they want to add about negotiating these different spaces.
I can speak. I guess to answer the question about how to introduce myself, I'm also very transdisciplinary. I have a background in art and biology, and I got really into biohacking as a way to negotiate those two different spaces, because as an artist, the challenge became getting access to laboratory resources and protocols. So, of course, biohacking was a really good segue or compromise as an artist working with biology. I guess on a more poetic note, I also identify as a Chinese American, a child of immigrant parents. I also see myself as the molecules that had an entire journey before they entered my body. Perhaps they had a journey through multiple bodies before they entered my body. And I also acknowledge the molecules that entered my mother's body when I was still incubating in her body. So in a sense, I consider myself this multi-generational being with a chemical legacy. So, and now I'm based in Vienna, Austria, of all places. So, so yeah, that's me.
Thank you. Timothée, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, This question is, I'm thinking about it a lot these days because I often introduce myself as an economist. And when you hear this, which is probably the least cool introduction ever, you think calculator with legs, number fetishist, or perhaps like, an obedient little defender of capitalism. Introduce yourself as economist sounds already like a cognitive disability, like it's a problem. And so I've been trying to, sometimes I broaden it to social scientists so that people don't get freaked out. And sometimes I feel a bit braver, and I'm trying to reclaim the term economy and economist as someone that study the satisfaction of needs, a sociologist, a very specialized sociologist that have been looking at one specific things. But I'm always stranded between these two, where I feel both ashamed of being an economist for what it has become, and on the other hand, I want also to show the pride in all the people that I admire that have managed to kind of bring back relevance into the way we do economics. So that's an unfolding battle.
Thank you so much. I asked this question really intentionally because it's something I think that maybe it's enabled all of us to recognize just the multiplicity of knowledge and knowledge making, and then the worlds that you create through those different kinds of knowledge-making practices. But it also means that the people who do this work have to inhabit all of these different spaces and negotiate different spaces, particularly in contexts like the university, which, I mean, is a big part of kind of creating these separations. I mean, there's a way that, arts and sciences, we study humans, we study non-humans in these very different modes and departments, and I find this really interesting because of my own work in artificial intelligence, but I know that many people, all of you here, are kind of negotiating those spaces, and I'm curious about how what you're effectively talking about is not just the end of objectivity, this kind of mechanical objectivity, but as Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison say, the study of objectivity is always a study of subjectivity, of these different selves. And I feel like all of you in your work are sort of approaching subjectivity from these different disciplines and perspectives. And what kinds of new skills or literacies do you think that we need to be able to appreciate these different ways of knowing and inhabiting the world and then envisioning new worlds? Because you're also sort of inside universities and outside them, you're in art practices. So through your work, how do you sort of negotiate this trying to talk about what you're doing, but having to, deal with limits to literacy that your different audiences or fellow travelers might be also struggling with themselves. So do you think that you all could talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I think when you asked about that question about subjectivity and objectivity or taking these positions, I was reminded of this painting from 18th century. It is called by Joseph Wright, and it's called "The Experiment with the Bird in a the experiment with the air pump and the bird." So you can imagine what kind of painting that is. It's obviously an early time of when science is kind of developing and all these new innovations happen and take place. And what this painting depicts is an experiment, a scientific experiment that is shown taking place in the room, in the house, with a group of people surrounding this table on which this scientist that is, with obviously white hair, already quite big white hair, standing above the table and performing these gestures. And of course, he has in front of him on the table, he has this apparatus, which is an air pump that was invented at the time, right? And And in order to show the workings of this apparatus, he decides to present it with this bird and puts the bird in the glass cage, and then you can imagine what happens, of course. And so the painting depicts the moment in which the bird dies, and there is a group of people, I think 3 or 4 men, who are this kind of obviously men from the society who are there to observe the experiment, and you can see their faces are very detached, and they look at it and there is no emotion whatsoever. There are some slightly perplexed women there, but also there are 2 little girls, and these are the only 2 who are just absolutely horrified about, to see what's happening. And I think this is an interesting example of how the kind of the subjective approaches and objective approaches, or kind of representations of certain ideas that we have about science, are kind of seen there, right? That we recognize who is the scientist there, who are the wise men, right? Whereas the kind of the horrified faces of these young girls show that obviously they don't know what's happening. They just simply don't know, and that's why they are afraid of something. And so I think there is continuous always this tension between these 2 positions, especially in the university or in knowledge-making practices, be it art or whatever, right? Like it is that kind of, again, negotiation of these places and maybe opening up certain kind of areas or moments in which some kind of knowing can happen. But, the question is what kind of knowing, under what conditions, to whom is this knowing available, and how we can recognize what is knowing and what isn't.
Any of the other panelists want to say anything? I'm looking directly at Timothée and Mary now. I don't know if you can see that.
Yes,
it seemed like you wanted to say
see
something.
You from very far away. Yes, I can say something. I mean, there are walls around the citadel of knowledge that is the modern university. And then there are just walls inside that university, spectacularly high walls around the Department of Economics, which must be one of the most hermetic space on earth, a desert of imagination. I don't know if you've been there, but it's a void. There are just more creative ideas in a black hole than in most economics department. And so for me, considering myself undisciplinary, what I'm trying to understand is that it's my study object, is the way we satisfy needs and what we feel about it, which is something indescribable. It's just so many people are trying to do this, whether they call themselves sociologists or anthropologists, whether they are at university or outside of it, whether they're in the realm of the abstract or in the realm of practices. So I don't want to let myself being just locked into that hermetic space and stop listening to the outside. So I think we need to blow up these disciplinary walls, this kind of protective belt around economics. And very practically, this means disrespecting in some kind of jargon and the knowledge of economics, starting with mathematical formalization, and somehow just creating little holes, allowing us to do what economists have been doing for decades, just legitimating their monopoly, which is to shape that reality that is so important to some of us. And in doing so, we should remember always, and that was the beginning of your question, that subjectivity stains everything and always in science, hence the importance of history of thought and the importance of sociology of knowledge. So these are important skills that we need to bring in our backpack as we kind of explore these walls, to not let ourselves be just locked in like old fellow economists I've been in the past.
Thank you. Mary, I see you. Yeah, I see you taking notes and smiling. Please go for it.
I guess to answer your question about objectivity, as a xenofeminist that practices biohacking, I kind of see the illusion of objectivity as contained in these black boxes, right? These black boxes that we don't question anymore and we don't open them anymore. We just accept them as truth. And I think that's what the authority of science has historically always done, is create more and more black boxes that we don't open anymore. You mentioned the end of objectivity, but I wonder if objectivity ever existed in the first place. There's this really great quote by Slavoj Žižek. He says, "Beyond the fiction of reality is the reality of fiction." And I really like this quote. And sometimes I feel like there is no objectivity. There's just a bunch of fictions that are struggling to coexist together. Fictions that come from colonial power structures, fictions of gender, binary gender. We're all struggling to coexist together. So I guess my question is there a way for to hold all these contradictions in the same space, right? That's what I think about a lot in my art practice.
Thank you. That's really well put. And I would actually ask Samir if you want to respond to that, this sort of, because you, I mean, I think it's super fascinating that you're trained as an artist, as an architect, and you work as an artist now. And how do you kind of negotiate those contradictions, as Mary was just saying?
And I agree with Mary. There never was objectivity. Probably there never is objectivity. To give an example, I can only talk about this through my art practice. So to give an example, a library, a building where we did a performance project, memory machines. And we worked with contemporary dancers and performers. And there was an insight when we were working with it that this smart building with sensors and cameras was reading us the same way we were trying to understand the building. And it's not just that now we're so technologically advanced that the building is reading us. The building was always reading us, and we were reading the building. It's always a two-way street. So I think the self, the body, everything around us is a projection of what we think and what we do, and our temperatures, our movements, our blood pressure, our protein intake that gets projected on anything around us. So that would be just a short take from my angle.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm just looking at the Telegram group, and I don't see any audience questions yet, which is fine. I have lots of other questions to pose to our discussants today. I think the other thing that I sort of think about a lot when we talk about kind of negotiating these multiple spaces is, what does this mean for research and artistic ethics and practices going forward? How do you kind of talk about this work when you're already situated in institutional frameworks that you rely on for resources, for different kinds of legitimacy? And I'm curious about sort of the community of practice that we develop to establish new ways of working in the world. And I wonder if you have any stories, any of you, about how you try to change your practice in very small, intimate ways, maybe, to institute ways of calculating otherwise. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. It's always. May I go? Sorry, I just jumped in.
Please.
Yeah, it's. You tell them, yeah, I have funding, and they agree to that of what you research and what you do. And I've seen myself as critiquing always the institutions in which I have been. I think that's the way, as a artist, academic, and as a experimental artist, without that critique of the institution, I don't think we can have we can open up new avenues of research and new avenues of artistic practice. So the institution, the how the classes are set and curriculums are set, and it is something which constantly develops and matures, and I see myself as someone who can work with it, critique it, and develop it and make it better.
Sorry, before going to the other participants today, I should also sort of annotate my comment, and something Samir said reminded me of this, that we are also sitting at the Haus der Kultur und der Welt in Berlin. Many of us work in European contexts. It is possible for many of us to have these kinds of conversations, and I know that where I come from, in India, and I know in many other parts of the world, it is not possible to be within institutional frameworks and to refuse them. You do have to accept just ways of doing things because your funding will be cut, your opportunities to do work will be cut. There is a limit on media freedom, there is a limit on academic freedom, and I want to very much recognize those realities that are unfolding, that have always been unfolding for many people who may be tuning in to this conversation today. So I don't want to assume that this is a privilege that everybody has to refuse in this way, but we are having a very specific and hopefully very inspiring conversations, even to people within this context. So I'm wondering if Magda or Mary or Timothée have anything they want to say more about negotiating, calculating otherwise? Okay, Timothée.
That made me think about, so I just finished my PhD, so I get thrown into the world of academia, and then people like older academics, I work in Sweden and in France mostly, and they explain me the rule of the game, and they're like, okay, well, you need to publish into certain journals, the one that have high impact factors. So I go and look over, they calculate, this impact factors, and realize that the entirety of academia is organized around boosting impact factor in the same way that we've misorganized the entire economy around the maximization of GDP. And so I'm like, so wait, so you want me to spend most of my work just publishing in those prestigious journals that happen to be owned by private corporation, which they sell for money, even though, my trade of work is anti-capitalist studies. So it feels very alienating. And then you want me also, criticizing the individualist competition of capitalism and engaging in the same type of competition at university through a kind of egotistic self-interest pursuit for personal prestige. So I find it very troubling that within that university, you will get no money whatsoever if you contribute to Wikipedia, writing articles that millions will read, but then you will get a lot of funding and actually monetary bonuses in the thousands of euros if you publish an article in Nature or in another journal that will only be accessible for an excessive amount of money to a few university scholars. So, and I keep in mind that, being a scholar in academics in Sweden or in France is just one of the most privileged positions in the world. And I see even them, people don't rebel against that system. They obediently play the game of impact factor in private publishing. So I find it strange because we're the one with where it will be easiest to resist that system. If we don't do it, I cannot even imagine for the people with lower funding and, no social guarantee behind the risk of being expelled from university and fired. So it's another one of my big division here, how to create knowledge, to criticize capitalism within capitalism, how to, let's say, protect yourself from the mechanics of capitalism inside university or perhaps outside for those that create knowledge outside of university.
Great, thank you. I noticed that we actually do have some questions from the audience that is remote. The first one, Lulu asks, can you please give more insight into the aspect of closing the common land by technology? Who is left out? Who controls what kind of technology with what kind of impact? Goes to Samir, I think.
What I mean, by enclosure, as I was echoing Sean Cubitt, and when he talks about the enclosure of common land, which was the property, well, there was no property. Land was free to have, and there was no permanent settlements, and might have been cities and villages. But this common land is with specific example to what happened in North America, where the land which was considered to be everyone's became appropriated and divided and gridded and calculated. So that is what I perhaps meant by the enclosure of the common land. And sorry, did I get that right, the answer?
I think so. I think so. Was that it? Yeah? Okay, great. There is another question that is actually to everybody on the panel, and maybe we can start with Magda for this in the 9 minutes that we have left. A question to everyone. In what Tim described as a utopia that forgot how to measure GDP, what are artists doing in this world? Is there perhaps a way they can contribute to the construction of this utopia? Would you like to take that on, Magda?
Sure. I wouldn't like to tell what artists should be doing, but the two works which I shown in my slides, there were two works, one by Cécile Mariton and another by Anders Visti, and these two works were kind of working with this idea of fermenting data and taking being invited to interpret what actually fermenting data might mean. So really, fermenting data is a kind of a device maybe to open up and to think with, and to project some ideas and propositions to, like how can we work with data? What are other processes of data processing techniques and methods that we can come up with that offer something else to us? And Cécile's work is especially interesting, and what she proposed for fermenting data, sphagnum time. She worked. Her proposal started with this idea of she wants to talk about bog bodies, so those bodies that are found in bogs that have been buried there for thousands of years. And she was thinking through this idea of what is the body in the bog body, right? And where does the body start and where it ends, and how the time is part of it. And she created this beautiful, together also with support of three voices and the composition from Jonathan Roos. She created this beautiful kind of opera almost, for 3 screens, and she created this story of where she actually interpreted the data of the bodies. And I think these kind of practices and this way of thinking, and she also used a lot of kind of her practice looks at toxicity as well, and different ways of measuring toxicity of the body, and she used these methods as well in creating her story. And I think this is just one example of many. I think what's interesting in Mary's work as well is this kind of bringing of measuring techniques and just turning them around and proposing something very different. I think that's what is so exciting about creative practice and what artists do.
Mm. Thank you. And actually, I was going to turn to Mary next and to sort of ask you, Mary, to sort of talk about artistic practice, but also this other big question that even though we're talking about calculation otherwise, you're also sort of creating new forms of instrumentation and new calculating and measuring devices. And every single device of measurement or calculation is sort of creating very different kinds of worlds, and your own world, really. I mean, we're never sort of away from calculation, and I don't want us to think that, anybody's actually saying we don't want calculation or data. We're saying let's be intentional about how we want to create data or generate certain kinds of facts to make different worlds. And how, as an artist and scientist, do you sort of negotiate the making of new kinds of instruments, new subjectivities, and your own artistic practice in knowledge making?
Sure. I would say my practice is more about the generation of new subjectivities, and then the generation of new instrumentations and apparatuses would be secondary to that. But I I think a lot about the generation of taxonomies and categories, because in this practice of measuring the body, I really appreciate how Samir talked about the enclosure of common land. I see that same enclosure happening to the body, the way that it's also divided and calculated and gridded. Um, and going back to this utopia where we no longer measure GDP, I would replace that word GDP with the body. You know, what is the utopia where we no longer measure the body? Maybe that also includes the planetary body. Because in this practice of generating taxonomies, you know, you're drawing these lines, these boundaries, these delineations that have the consequence of othering. You know, and this process of othering is a violent process. I mean, there's that process of alienation that happens when you define yourself as different from the other. So I'm really curious, can we generate taxonomies without this violent process of othering? Could we design taxonomies where there's the acknowledgement of change that's embedded like in the very definition of that taxonomy? Because I think taxonomies will, they eventually become obsolete. You know, we see that with the toxicities influencing and problematizing our definitions of the body. So yeah, and so creating new subjectivities, that's kind of like the next step, right? Like after you realize how obsolete these definitions are, it's like what comes next, right? And so I'm operating more in this space.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that. And I wonder if any of the other participants today have any other sort of thoughts on that. There is a question that we don't have too much time for, but it's sort of touches on this, and it's a big one. It's like, do we need numbers at all? Like the fact that we even use numbers is sort of talking to this practice of, is sort of in an established logic of counting. So how is it otherwise? And I wonder if Timothée or Magda or Samir have any final thoughts on that. Are we talking about a reality outside numbers entirely?
I think these are, very briefly, I think these are all methods of abstraction and concealment. These are all act as delay of measures. All these units and metrics, they are just representation of undefinable value. I agree with the person, we should give away with numbers. Perhaps we should have other ways, other metrics, other ways to calculate things. Maybe we shouldn't calculate at all.
I was checking the etymology of calculus. I thought that was quite nice because I think, Timothée, you must know it because I think it's Latin. So in French, I don't know French, but it means small. Calculus means small stones. And I think this is such a nice way, actually, you know, if we bring that to that idea of small stones, then perhaps there is something poetic in calculus and calculation. And actually, I think abstraction shouldn't be completely thrown away. I think abstraction allows us to make connections, to create also relations, even, to abstract the body, as Mary, you show us, right, in that way. On one hand, to abstract it and then to bring it back to its materiality is really quite an exciting method, right? That kind of brings in something that perhaps we shouldn't completely dissolve. That would be my call.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to close it on that and say thank you very much to all of our panelists today for sharing their work. And on a poetic note, say that, it's been a wonderful discussion. So thank you all very much, and good night and good luck. Bye.